There's a fatal misconception buried deep in the strategic doctrine of every naval power that has never faced the United States Navy in open blue water combat. They believe that distance equals safety. They've convinced themselves that if they can push their engagement envelope far enough, if they can launch their most sophisticated anti-ship weapons from beyond the visible horizon, they can hurt us before we can respond. And for exactly 11 seconds on a crystalline morning in the northern Arabian Sea, Iranian fire control officers believed they had accomplished exactly that. Their most advanced coastal defense battery had just achieved a solid radar lock on the USS Gerald R. Ford strike group at a range of 400 nautical miles. The launch authorization was transmitted. The solid fuel ignition sequence initiated. A 7,000-pound semi-ballistic anti-ship missile tore away from its mobile platform at Mach 3.5, climbing toward the edge of space before beginning its terminal dive toward the most expensive warship ever constructed by human civilization. In that crystalline moment of launch, sitting in their hardened command bunker, those fire control officers believed they had rewritten the rules of naval warfare. They were catastrophically wrong, not because their missile was inadequate, not because their targeting data was flawed, but because they fundamentally misunderstood what happens when you attempt to threaten a $13 billion supercarrier that detected your missile the exact millisecond your radar emissions touched its hull 400 miles away. You have to understand something absolutely foundational about modern naval warfare. When we talk about carrier strike group defense, we're not describing a ship with weapons. We're describing a floating sensor grid synchronized into a network kill web that begins hunting you the instant you even think about becoming a threat. And the absolute heart of that sensor architecture is a piece of technology so fundamentally advanced that it doesn't just change the rules of naval engagement. It rewrites the physics of what's possible in electromagnetic detection. The InSpy-6 air and missile defense radar. 4 massive arrays mounted on the island superstructure of every Ford-class carrier, each face containing tens of thousands of individual gallium nitride transmit and receive modules, operating as a single-phased array. Aperture. This isn't your grandfather's rotating radar dish. This is a solid-state electromagnetic lens that can simultaneously track hundreds of targets across thousands of cubic miles of airspace while maintaining such absurd sensitivity that it can detect a baseball-sized object at ranges exceeding 300 miles. But here's what separates this system from everything that came before it. The SPY-6 doesn't operate on a single frequency band. It dynamically hops across multiple segments of the electromagnetic spectrum, adjusting its waveform thousands of times per second to defeat jamming, burn through clutter, and classify targets based on their radar cross-section signature. When that Iranian missile battery 402 miles away energized its fire control radar to achieve terminal lock, it had to paint the Ford with electromagnetic energy. That energy had to travel through the atmosphere, bounce off the carrier's hull, and return to the Iranian receiver. And in that fraction of a second, before the missile ever left its launcher, the SPY-6 had already detected the inbound radar pulse, analyzed its waveform characteristics, triangulated the emission source, classified it as a targeting radar associated with a known anti-ship missile system, and automatically elevated the threat level across the entire strike group. Data link. Distance does not equal safety. Distance equals time. And time is the currency that dictates survival in modern naval warfare. At 400 nautical miles, traveling at Mach 3.5 with a ballistic flight profile, that Iranian missile had roughly 14 minutes of flight time before reaching the outer edge of the carrier strike group's defensive perimeter. 14 minutes sounds like an eternity in the context of human reaction time. But in the machine-driven kill chain of integrated air and missile defense, 14 minutes is a geological epoch of battle space preparation. The instant the SPY-6 classified that radar emission and projected the likely launch basket, the Aegis combat system didn't wait for human authorization to begin prosecuting the threat. Within 1.2 seconds of initial detection, threat parameters were automatically transmitted via cooperative engagement capability data link to every air warfare platform within 200 miles. The 2 Arleigh-Burke-class destroyers operating as picket escorts 80 miles ahead of the Ford received targeting quality track data before the missile had even cleared its launcher. The E-2D Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft loitering at 25,000 feet instantly redirected its PY-9 radar to refine the track and began feeding updates into the network. 4 FA-18 Super Hornets returning from a combat air patrol were automatically retasked. receiving digital intercept vectors on their cockpit displays without a single voice transmission. And deep in the Combat Information Center aboard the Ford, the Air Warfare Coordinator watched his tactical display populate with a branching decision tree of intercept options, each one calculated and ranked by probability of kill. The machine had already built the solution set. The humans simply had to authorize execution. Here's the brutal mathematics that enemy strategists always fail to account for. A carrier strike group doesn't defend a single point in space. It defends a layered battle space extending outward in concentric rings of overlapping kill zones, each one designed to attrite inbound threats at progressively closer ranges, and the geometry of those rings is dictated by one unforgiving variable: missile kinematics versus interceptor kinematics. That Iranian missile, despite its impressive Mach 3.5 speed, was following a ballistic trajectory. It had to climb to altitude to extend its range, which meant for a significant portion of its flight profile, it was coasting unpowered in a predictable parabolic arc. Ballistic trajectories are beautiful to physicists and suicidal against integrated air defense networks, because once you commit to that flight path, you can't maneuver. You become a calculus problem. And the Aegis system solves calculus problems with cold, ruthless efficiency. At 380 miles from the strike group, while the missile was still climbing toward apogee, the forward Arleigh Burke destroyer initiated the first intercept. No dramatic countdowns, no shouted commands, just a digital authorization transmitted to a Mark 41 vertical launch system cell and a single RIM 174 standard extended range active missile. The SM-6 punched through the cell's membrane and ignited. The SM-6 is not a simple interceptor. It's a Mach 3.5 capable, dual-mode seeker equipped with both active radar homing and infrared terminal guidance, carrying a 140-pound blast fragmentation warhead specifically designed to shred the control surfaces and fuel tanks of incoming anti-ship missiles. It doesn't need to score a direct hit. It just needs to get close enough to turn a precisely guided threat into tumbling debris. But here's where the network kill web reveals its most terrifying capability. That SM-6 wasn't relying on its own small radar seeker to find the target. It was being fed continuous mid-course guidance updates directly from the SPY-6 array and the E-to-D Hawkeye, using a technique called cooperative engagement capability. The missile's onboard processor didn't need to search thousands of cubic miles of sky. It was told exactly where to look, second by second, all the way to intercept. At 190 miles from the launch destroyer, flying at 87,000 feet, the XM-6's active seeker transitioned to terminal homing. It had already been positioned within 5 miles of the projected intercept point by the network. Now it just had to close the final gap. The infrared seeker locked onto the thermal plume of the Iranian missile's motor casing, still radiating heat from its boost phase. The proximity fuse armed, and at a closing velocity of nearly Mach 7, the two objects merged into the same cubic meter of airspace. The XM-6's warhead detonated 40 feet from the Iranian missile's midsection, releasing an expanding cloud of tungsten fragmentation rods traveling at 6,000 feet per second. The rods perforated the missile's thin aluminum airframe like a shotgun blast through cardboard, severing hydraulic lines, puncturing fuel tanks, and snapping the guidance computer's mounting structure. The missile didn't explode in a cinematic fireball. It simply stopped being a guided weapon and became a ballistic object obeying gravity and drag, tumbling out of control and disintegrating from aerodynamic forces before impacting the ocean 160 miles from the carrier. Total elapsed time from launch detection to kinetic intercept, 11 minutes, 34 seconds. The Iranian fire control officers never received confirmation of impact. They never received any data at all, because the moment their radar went active to assess battle damage, they painted themselves as a target for immediate suppression. But let's pause the tactical sequence and dig into what actually happened at the physics level, because this is where the true lethality of the system reveals itself. When people hear that a carrier detected a missile at 400 miles, they imagine a blip appearing on a screen. That's not what occurred. What occurred was a multispectral sensor fusion event across 4 separate domains simultaneously. The SPY-6 radar detected the missile body via reflected electromagnetic energy. The space-based infrared system satellites in geosynchronous orbit detected the infrared bloom of the rocket motor ignition from 22,000 miles above the Earth. The SLQ-32 electronic warfare suite aboard the Ford detected and classified the specific radar emission signature of the targeting system, and the acoustic sensors on the forward destroyers detected the launch transient through underwater sound propagation. 4 completely independent sensor streams, each operating on different physical principles, all converging into a single fused track within 2.8 seconds. This is sensor fusion at a level that didn't exist a decade ago. The system doesn't just detect threats, it builds a multi-dimensional probability cloud of threat origin, trajectory, type, and intent before the enemy has even finished their launch sequence. Now let's talk about what happens when the first intercept fails. Because in the real physics of missile defense, there is no such thing as a 100% probability of kill. And so the system is architected with the assumption that any single intercept might fail, which is why the defensive geometry is built in layers. Let's rewind the scenario and assume that first SM-6 suffered a seeker malfunction and flew past the target. The instant the Aegis system registered no detonation signature at the predicted intercept point, 2 more SM-6 interceptors launched from the second Arleigh Burke destroyer positioned 60 miles closer to the threat axis. These weren't blind reaction shots. The network had watched the first intercept attempt, refined the target track based on observed missile maneuvers, and adjusted the intercept geometry for the follow-on shots. Because the Iranian missile was now 120 miles closer and descending toward its terminal phase, optimized for head-on intercepts against targets at medium altitude. And if those failed, the third layer was already spinning up. The Evolve Sea Sparrow missiles in the inner defense zone, with engagement ranges out to 30 miles, but the Iranians had anticipated layered defense. That's why they didn't launch one missile. In the actual tactical scenario, they launched a salvo of 4 missiles, spaced 15 seconds apart, each one programmed with slightly different flight profiles to complicate the defense's intercept math. This is called saturation attack theory, the idea being that if you flood the defensive network with more inbound threats than it has interceptors, something will leak through. It's sound logic against legacy point defense systems. It is catastrophically flawed logic against a network kill web with over 400 ready interceptors distributed across multiple platforms. The moment the second, third, and fourth missiles entered the battle space, the Aegis system didn't treat them as separate problems. It treated them as a single raid package and began allocating interceptors across the entire strike group inventory to prosecute all tracks simultaneously. The forward destroyers engaged the first and second missiles. The aft destroyers took the third, and the fourth missile, which had been launched on a depressed trajectory to skim the sea surface and exploit radar horizon limitations, was assigned to the FA-18 Super Hornets that had been vectored into blocking positions 150 miles from the carrier. Those Hornets weren't carrying bombs. They were loaded with AIM-120D advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles, and while the AIM-120 is designed to kill aircraft, its active radar seeker and high-G maneuverability make it devastatingly effective against sea-skimming anti-ship missiles. The lead Hornet pickled off 2 AIM-120S in a high-low bracket, and both missiles guided to intercept, shredding the Iranian sea skimmer at 90 miles from the ford. 4 inbound threats, 4 kinetic intercepts. Total time from initial raid detection to final intercept, 13 minutes 22 seconds. And here's the critical parameter. At no point did any of those missiles get closer than 85 nautical miles to the carrier. The outer defense perimeter held. The middle layer never had to engage. The inner point defense systems never even trained their fire control radars on a live target. This is what overmatch looks like in modern naval warfare. It's not dramatic. It's not close. It's a machine coldly solving geometry problems faster than the enemy can present new variables. But let's dig even deeper, because the truly horrifying capability isn't just the intercept. It's what happens immediately after the intercept. The moment the Aegis system confirmed kinetic kills on all 4 inbound missiles, the network had already backtracked their launch trajectories to probable origin points. Those origin points were cross-referenced against known Iranian coastal defense positions in the targeting database, and within 90 seconds of the last intercept, strike packages were being generated to neutralize the launchers before they could reload. 2 F-35C Lightning II stealth fighters that had been loitering in holding patterns 200 miles from the coast received encrypted targeting data and new mission taskings. They didn't need to use their own radars. They were handed GPS coordinates accurate to within 3 meters, derived from the same sensor fusion network that detected the original launch. The Iranians had fired 4 missiles and revealed their position. The Ford's response was to dispatch 2 aircraft carrying 8 AG M154 joint standoff weapons, each one a 100-pound class glide bomb with a 60-mile standoff range. The F-35s never entered Iranian airspace. They simply reached their launch points, released their weapons, and aggressed while the JSOs glided autonomously to target, guided by GPS and imaging infrared seekers. The mobile launchers that had fired those 4 missiles were obliterated in their reload positions 47 minutes after their initial launch. The battery commander never had the opportunity to fire a second salvo. This is the closed-loop kill chain. Detection leads to intercept. Intercept leads to targeting. Targeting leads to suppression. And suppression removes the threat from the battle space permanently. The carrier never maneuvered. The carrier never increased speed. The carrier continued flight operations without interruption because the defensive network prosecuted the entire threat sequence 100 miles beyond the range where the ship itself was ever in danger. Now let's talk about what happens when the enemy gets smart and tries to defeat the system with the one tactic that should theoretically work: electronic warfare. Because the Iranians weren't stupid. They knew the Americans relied on radar and data links. So they deployed their most sophisticated jamming systems, flooding the electromagnetic spectrum with high-powered noise across the X-band and S-band frequencies where American fire control radars operate. It's a sound strategy against legacy systems. Against the Spy-6 and Aegis Baseline 10, it's the equivalent of screaming in the face of someone who can read lips, because the Spy-6 doesn't rely on a single frequency. It's a software-defined wideband array that can shift frequencies faster than a jammer can track. When the jamming began, the system detected the interference, characterized the waveform, identified the transmission source, and simply shifted to a different part of the spectrum where the jamming had no effect. And here's the beautiful brutality of the physics. The jammer itself became a target. High-powered radio frequency emitters are like bonfires in the darkness to passive detection systems. The moment that jammer lit up, every electronic support measures receiver in the strike group had a precise bearing to the source. Triangulation from multiple platforms gave a GPS quality position fix. And that jammer site was added to the target deck for immediate suppression. The E-18G Growler electronic attack aircraft orbiting 100 miles from the coast didn't even need to get close. It simply fired an AG-8080 advanced anti-radiation missile, which homes on radar and jammer emissions, flying down the bearing at Mach 2 and detonating directly over the transmitter array. The jamming stopped. The system continued operating without interruption. This is why electronic warfare against the United States Navy is not a defensive tactic. It's a way to tell us exactly where you are so we can kill you more efficiently. Let's now examine the scenario from the Iranian perspective, because understanding their decision-making calculus reveals why this engagement was doomed from the first second. Iranian naval doctrine is built on the concept of asymmetric warfare. They know they cannot build a blue water navy to contest American carriers in open ocean, so they've invested in long-range anti-ship missiles, coastal defense batteries, and swarm tactics using fast attack craft. The theory is that if they can mass enough threats simultaneously, they can overwhelm American defenses through sheer volume. It's the same saturation theory that worked for the Soviets during the Cold War, except the Soviets were planning to launch hundreds of missiles from dozens of platforms simultaneously, and they were facing 1980s era point defense systems with limited magazines and no network queuing. The Iranians launched 4 missiles from one battery and faced a network kill web with over 400 interceptors, real-time space-based surveillance, and AI-assisted fire control. The math was never in their favor. But they didn't know that, because they had no operational experience against this generation of American naval technology. Their wargames and simulations were based on assumptions about intercept rates and reaction times that were already a decade out of date. They assumed that 400 miles was beyond effective engagement range. They assumed that multiple missiles would complicate the defense. They assumed that jamming would degrade targeting. Every single assumption was wrong, and here's the most catastrophic part of their miscalculation. They believed that launching a missile at an American carrier was a tactical decision. It wasn't. It was a strategic declaration that they were willing to accept annihilation in response. Because the United States Navy doesn't respond to attacks on capital ships with proportional force. It responds with erasure. The moment those missiles launched, the Ford Strike Group transitioned from peacetime posture to active combat operations. Rules of engagement shifted. Targeting authorities expanded, and every Iranian military installation within 500 miles of the coast became a legitimate target for immediate strike. The Iranians fired 4 missiles and lost not just the launchers, but the entire coastal defense network that supported them. Radar sites, command bunkers, ammunition depots, all of it marked for destruction within the first 6 hours of hostilities. Because the carrier didn't just survive the attack, it used the attack as justification to dismantle the entire threat infrastructure. This is the doctrine of overwhelming response. You don't just defeat the attack, you eliminate the capacity to launch future attacks. You don't just win the engagement, you remove the enemy from the strategic equation entirely. And you do it so decisively that every other adversary watching learns the lesson without having to experience it themselves. Let's talk about the human element, because none of this happens without the sailors and officers who operate these systems under unimaginable pressure. When that first missile warning flashed on the displays in the Ford's Combat Information Center, the Air Warfare Coordinator had less than 30 seconds to verify the track, confirm it wasn't a false alarm, and authorized offensive weapons release. 30 seconds to make a decision that could start a war if he's wrong or cost thousands of lives if he hesitates. And he made the call because he trusted the system, because he'd trained for this exact scenario hundreds of times, and because he knew that every sensor input had been verified across multiple platforms. That kind of confidence doesn't come from technology alone. It comes from a training pipeline that puts operators through stress inoculation scenarios so realistic that when the actual event occurs, it feels familiar. It comes from a culture of operational excellence where mistakes in peacetime exercises are treated as catastrophic failures that must be corrected immediately. It comes from knowing that every single system on that ship has been tested, validated, and maintained to a standard that borders on obsessive. The machines are incredible, but they're operated by humans who have internalized the idea that failure is not an option because the consequences of failure are measured in burning wreckage and flag-draped coffins. And here's what the sailors in that Combat Information Center understood that the Iranian fire control officers did not. The Ford wasn't just defending itself. It was defending the entire strike group, the logistics vessels trailing behind, the allied ships operating in company, and the broader strategic mission that carrier represents. A carrier doesn't sail alone because it needs protection. A carrier sails with a strike group because it projects power across 1,000 miles of ocean, and that power has to be sustained, coordinated, and defended as a unified whole. Every destroyer, every cruiser, every aircraft, every submarine in that formation is a node in a network designed to ensure that the carrier can continue flight operations under any threat condition. And when you attack one node, you activate the entire network. You don't fight a ship. You fight a distributed kill web that has more sensors, more shooters, and more processing power than most nations' entire military inventory. This is why carrier strike groups don't lose symmetrical engagements. The math doesn't allow it. But let's examine what would have happened if, through some catastrophic combination of failures, one of those missiles had actually gotten through the defensive layers and hit the Ford. Let's assume a miracle shot, jamming worked, interceptors missed, and a 700-pound warhead detonated against the carrier's hull at the waterline. What happens next? First, the physical damage. Modern supercarriers are compartmentalized into thousands of individual spaces separated by watertight bulkheads and armored decks. A single missile hit, even a large one, isn't going to sink a 1,000-ton warship. It's going to punch a hole, start fires, and kill sailors in the immediate blast zone. The ship's damage control teams would activate within seconds, sealing bulkheads, fighting fires, and stabilizing the vessel. The Ford would likely remain operational, though degraded. But here's the strategic consequence that matters more than the tactical damage. The moment an American carrier takes a hit, the gloves come off. The political and legal restraints that normally govern military operations evaporate. The strike package that goes airborne in the next 6 hours won't be hitting coastal defense batteries. It'll be hitting regime leadership bunkers, national command centers, and strategic infrastructure. Because you don't get to damage a $13 billion warship and walk away with a bloody nose. You get erased. This is the doctrine of disproportionate escalation, and it's the reason adversaries are terrified of actually pulling the trigger. They know that even a successful hit on a carrier triggers a response so overwhelming that it negates any tactical victory they might have achieved. So they posture. They threaten. They run exercises and fire missiles into the ocean to demonstrate capability. But they don't actually shoot, because the cost-benefit calculation is existentially negative. And that brings us to the final, most important lesson embedded in this entire scenario. The purpose of a $13 billion supercarrier is not to fight. It's to make fighting unnecessary. The Ford doesn't need to prove it can survive a missile attack, because the sheer capability it represents deters adversaries from launching the attack in the first place. Every sensor, every interceptor, every networked kill chain exists not to be used in anger, but to be so overwhelmingly credible that rational adversaries choose not to test them. This is deterrence through visible overmatch. And when deterrence fails, when some adversary makes the catastrophic miscalculation that they can hurt us and survive the response, the system activates, not with rage, not with hesitation, but with cold, mechanical precision. The missiles get detected at 400 miles. The interceptors launch. The threats get neutralized. The launchers get destroyed. And the carrier continues flight operations as if nothing happened, because to the machine, nothing did. It was just another geometry problem, solved in real time, with kinetic finality. That's what happens when you threaten a $13 billion supercarrier. You don't get a fair fight. You don't get a chance to reload. You get erased from the battle space so efficiently that the historical record will barely note your attempt. And every other adversary watching learns that 400 miles isn't a standoff range. It's just early detection, giving us more time to decide exactly how we want to end. You.